All right, so kind of quickly recapping where we've been. We're walking through this Believe series, comes from the passage in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 13 and 14 that we've read many, many times now. You see it up there on the screen where Paul, an early church leader, writing to a church he helped start in the town of Corinth 2,000 years ago, had all kinds of instructions, summarized them for them in this kind of sequence of 5 commands that we've been talking about. And we're looking at the specific one to stand firm in the faith. And we said it's so important because what we believe always affects and influences how we behave. And so it's important that we know what we believe and that we persevere in that. We live in a world that's just working so hard against the things that we believe are essential to actually who God made us to be and what God has revealed to us about himself. And so we want to be men that stand firm in our faith and the things that we believe that God's revealed to us. And so that's what we're walking through in the series. As we've done this so far, we've got a variety of topics. You see those up there on the screen as well. We're talking about theology and anthropology, Christology, kingdomology, which I made that one up, the term there at least, pneumatology, and ecclesiology. And so far, a couple weeks ago, we talked about theology, what we believe about God, that God is a triune creator on mission to redeem this broken world that he loves and that he made. Last week, we talked about our part in that, anthropology, what we believe about humankind, that our human dignity has been distorted by human depravity. And we talked about this idea that all of us have been infected, all of us have been affected. We've all experienced this kind of fall, this brokenness, and every problem that we face in your life and in our world is a result of that, as we talked about. And so today we're getting to the God's solution, his answer to that, which is himself in the person of his son, Jesus, who we're going to talk about together tonight. So we're going to walk through some of this, and again, we're going to continue that outline that we've been making our way through the last several weeks, what and so what. And so if you see your notes, again, if you've been around here, you know the drill. I give you some notes every week to follow along with, encourage you to take those out. And we want to walk through this. Now, kind of the big idea tonight, or the theme, or the summary of what we're going to talk about together, again, comes from the reading that you did this week as it relates to Jesus. And what you'll find there in your notes, what you see in your book, what you see up on the screen as well is this. When we talk about Jesus tonight, we're going to be talking about him in these terms, that Jesus is fully God and fully human, and he came to save. So those 3 things, we just want to spend some time talking about that. I want to talk first about this idea of Jesus being fully God or fully divine. And this is absolutely essential to our faith, to what we believe. It's one of the things that actually distinguishes our faith from every other religion, every other faith in the world. The fact that we believe Jesus wasn't just some good teacher. He wasn't just some model man that we follow our lives after, but he actually was God himself, fully God. Absolutely essential that we believe this. Anyone that suggests otherwise is really deviating from the faith that we hold to, that we believe God's revealed to us. And I wish I had more time tonight to spend a lot of time unpacking why we believe he's God. And there's a whole realm of conversations, kind of like theology. It's something called apologetics. And it has to do with how we defend our faith and why we believe what we believe. And we could, again, like all of these topics, we could spend weeks and weeks and weeks talking about the apologetics or the defense for why we believe Jesus is God. We're not going to be able to spend a lot of time on that tonight. But I want to give you just a couple quick explanations for why we believe this or what we believe about this. And it basically comes from a couple things. First of all, the claims of Jesus. If Jesus was God, if he was fully divine, if he was God in human flesh, we would expect him to say so, right? That he would declare that about himself, that he would claim that in some way. Jesus certainly did a lot of God-like things. He did miracles, he healed, he did all sorts of supernatural things. But if Jesus never claimed to be God, I think maybe we'd be on a little bit shaky ground here. But there are a variety of examples of Jesus either claiming that he was God or others were, and Jesus didn't do anything about it, didn't deny it, didn't do anything to reject that. A couple quick examples I'll give you where Jesus says something as far as kind of a claim of being God. One is found in the book of John. John was one of Jesus' closest followers, one of his closest friends early on, and one of his 12 disciples, if you're familiar with that terminology. And John walked with Jesus for years, and then one of the gifts that he's given to us is he recorded his experiences. He wrote down what he saw, what he heard, what he experienced with Jesus. And we have several books actually from John. One of them is just called John. We find it in the New Testament of our Bibles. And in John chapter 10, He's recording a story of some teaching Jesus did one day where Jesus was talking about how he was like a good shepherd. And he said that he takes care of his sheep and that God the Father has entrusted sheep to Jesus as a good shepherd. And he says, no one's going to be able to snatch them out of my hands. And as he's describing this and talking about him and God the Father, he makes this phrase that you see there in John chapter 10, verse 30, where he says, I and the Father are one. Now, in case this doesn't seem very clear, as you read on just a couple verses later, the people, when they heard Jesus say this, some of the good religious people of his day that thought something like that would be absolutely preposterous, they were actually ready to kill Jesus for saying these words. So there was no confusion in his original audience there. When he said these words, they knew what he was saying, that he was saying he and the Father were one, that he was essentially God. Another example I'll give you is found in John 8:58, a couple chapters earlier, same book, written down by this follower of Jesus, guy by the name of John. And in this passage, there's some debating going on between Jesus and some other religious leaders, some Jewish religious leaders of his day, and he's talking to them. And one of their heroes of the Jewish faith was a guy named Abraham, and so they're kind of going back and forth, and Jesus is using some things about Abraham almost against them to reveal who he is. And eventually they're like, wait a minute, Jesus, are you trying to say you're bigger and better than Abraham? And Jesus responds to them with these words that you see in John 8, verse 58 there, where he says, before Abraham was born, I am. In other words, I predated Abraham. I was around before he was. And not only that, that phrase, I am, was actually a tie-in. It was a toss by Jesus to the Old Testament name of God that means I am. And it was unmistakable. Jesus was connecting himself with God the Father, in essence, saying to the people there, and it caused him all sorts of trouble in making these claims and essentially declaring that he was God. Now, again, he did a bunch of other things that seemed to support that. He did miracles. He raised a person from the dead, actually several different examples of supernatural healings and things like that in Jesus' ministry. He did all sorts of things, but those didn't really prove it in and of itself. The thing that really substantiated what Jesus said about himself was his own resurrection. We talked a little bit about this over the last couple of weeks, and Jesus, one of the things that I think is so compelling about him, and if you have doubts about Jesus and you're like, yeah, I don't know, maybe he taught some good things, he said some good things, but I'm not sure I really buy into the fact that he was God. One of the things that I just, in my own personal wrestle with faith, that I just can't escape is the idea that Jesus called his own shot, that he would die and rise again, and he pulled it off. And I don't know about you, but I don't know anybody else like that. And I think when somebody calls their own shot with that, it's worth leaning in and listening, and perhaps there's something that substantiates the claims that they made about themselves. Now, not only did this substantiate what Jesus said about himself, it actually began to radically change what everybody else around him started to say about him as well. And so one of the other reasons that we believe Jesus is God is not only the claims of Jesus, but also the claims of other people. His first followers. There wasn't a group of people that one day said, let's just make up a story about a guy named Jesus and say that he died and rose again, and we'll make a religious rule book and people can follow it and make our own religion out of this thing. These were real people who walked with Jesus in his day, who saw with their own eyes and touched with their own hands and experienced him for several years, walking with him and talking with him, and saw him on the cross, dead, and saw him taken down from the cross and put in an empty tomb, dead, and saw that nothing happened for several days. He was dead. And in that moment, there were no followers of Jesus. There were no believers. We've done some Andy Stanley series at time. I think he does a great job of illustrating this for us. At that point, at the cross, there were no Christians. All their hopes in this guy who they thought was this promised one from God who had come to save and rescue the people of Israel, really, and perhaps the world. When Jesus died on the cross, he was just like all the rest of them. They had been fooled. They misunderstood. They thought maybe he was the one. And obviously, when he was dead on the cross, obviously to them, he wasn't. Until a few days later, something radically transformational happened. Jesus rose from the dead. And people saw him. They didn't just make up a story about it. They saw him and touched him, having been raised again from the dead. And it changed everything. These same people that were scared for their life, these people that were worried about themselves being persecuted and perhaps even put on their own cross, they were afraid. One follower, a guy by the name of Peter, was afraid to admit that he even knew Jesus. And just days later, now he's out preaching in the same streets with the people who had crucified Jesus. And now he's calling them all out and saying that this Jesus you crucified, he was the one. He's the one you've been waiting for. Something changed for them that substantiated what Jesus claimed about himself, and it was the resurrection, that Jesus died, but then he rose again. And it changed the way that they began to describe him and the claims that others made about him as well. I got a handful of examples that I'll give you here real quick. In John chapter 1, verse 1, again, one of his closest followers, one of his first closest friends there, a guy by the name of John, who I told you about a moment ago, he wrote at the very beginning of his book, in the beginning was the Word. This was a description of Jesus there, the word he was using to describe Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, or was Jesus, and the Word, Jesus, was with God, and the Word was God. He was convinced. In fact, he even got to the point of being persecuted himself for this very truth of his belief in Jesus as God. Another example from John at the end of his book, in John chapter 20, verse 31, he was describing why he wrote his book. And he says this: Jesus performed many other signs, miracles that are in the presence of his disciples that are not recorded in this book. But these ones I've written down so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John wrote his whole book, the book that we have in our Bible called John, to demonstrate, to convince, to let people know that Jesus was in fact God. A little earlier, just a couple verses earlier, in John 20, verse 28 there, a guy by the name of Thomas. Some of you know the story. This was doubting Thomas. Thomas, after the resurrection, some of the other followers of Jesus had seen Jesus. Thomas hadn't yet. They're all saying, Thomas, you're not going to believe it. Jesus was dead, but he's been raised to life again. And Thomas is like, I'm not sure I'm buying it until I see it for myself, until I touch his side, until I see the holes in his hands. And Jesus appears to him, and when Thomas sees him, he responds with these words. He says, my Lord and my what? My God. The resurrection changed things. Not only did Jesus claim this about himself, it changed what others claimed about him as well. One of the other followers of Jesus, a guy named Peter, who I just told you about in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, one of the letters that he wrote in his description of Jesus. Again, this was Peter, who was one of his most bold and passionate followers, who at the cross, when Jesus was being kind of prosecuted and on his way to being crucified, Peter's sitting there in the courtyard and people are like, hey, wait a minute, we recognize you. You're one of his followers. And Peter denies even knowing Jesus 3 times. He's so afraid of losing his own life. And yet days later, when he sees the resurrected Jesus, he's never the same again. And he goes on, he writes letters at the beginning of one like this: Simon Peter, a servant and apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who through the righteousness of our God and Savior Jesus Christ have received a faith as precious as ours. This was his claim about Jesus. Another early church leader, a guy by the name of Titus, in Titus chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, he's writing, Paul was writing to Titus, and he says this: while we wait for the blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from all wickedness and to purify for himself a people that are his very own. Again, the testimony of people, even God the Father himself, in the words that we have from him recorded in the book of Hebrews, chapter 1, verse 8, says about the Son, about Jesus, he, the Father, says, your throne, O God, Jesus, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom. Not only did Jesus claim this about himself, but after his resurrection, everyone around him who knew him well, who had seen the things that they saw, they began to claim these same things about him, that Jesus was fully God. Absolutely essential, absolutely critical to what we believe about him and what we believe about who he was. Not only was he fully God, though, he was also fully human. And again, there's a lot of different things that we can say about this, a lot of time we could spend on this. I gave you just kind of a statement there that describes some of the things that we see in the life of Jesus that reflect his humanity that you see up there on the screen. Jesus was born as a baby. We celebrate this at Christmas time. He grew as a young boy, just like all of us in the room did. We were born into the world as a baby. We grew up as young kids, just as Jesus did. He worked, he provided, took care of his family, just like us. He related to others in a lot of different ways, and he relates to us in our day as well. He was tempted just like we are. He suffered, as all of us are familiar with, in different ways in our own lives as well. And he died an actual physical human death in our place. Just to put it kind of differently on the next slide here, you'll see, again, he had a human genealogy. He had a human birth. One of the early kind of church leaders, or at least one of the guys that helped write some of the books that we have in our Bible, was a guy by the name of Luke. The first 4 books that we have in our New Testament, we call them the Gospels. They're just a word that means good news. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each of those guys wrote their books to kind of capture who Jesus was and what he had done. And one in particular, this guy named Luke, actually really helps us see, probably clearer than anybody else, the humanity of Jesus. Luke was a physician, so he was a doctor. He knew about people as human beings, as physical bodies, and so he recorded a lot of the stuff about Jesus that would relate to that. He told us about his human genealogy. He told us about his human birth, again, that we talk about. We read about that from the book of Luke every year at Christmas. He described Jesus' human growth and development, that he grew in stature and he grew in his favor with God and with other people. He talked about, not only Luke, but Matthew, Mark, and John as well, talked about Jesus' human limitations, his human emotions, his human family, just like us. We read descriptions in Luke, also in the book of Matthew, of Jesus facing human temptation, like all of us do. And yet we also read in the book of Hebrews chapter 4 that while Jesus was tempted in every way that we are, in the same ways that we are, he was without sin. In fact, he might have endured temptation beyond what you and I experience because he never gave in. He endured it to the fullest extent, just as we have, and yet was without sin. He experienced human suffering, loss of loved ones, suffering physically in his own life, particularly on the cross itself, and of course, human death. Jesus was not only fully God, he was also fully human. And then the last part there, as we said, he came to save. And I want to unpack this, what we mean by that for you over the next few minutes, what we mean by that. There's a few different elements to this that I want to share with you that you see there in your notes, and I think all of them are absolutely essential, so important for us. The first one that you see there is this, and when it comes to this idea of Jesus coming to save, part of what we mean by that is that he came to rescue us from sin and death. We mentioned this last week. All of us have been infected and affected by this thing called sin, this idea of missing the mark of what God created us to be and the kind of life that he created us to live. We've all missed that mark. We've all been infected by that. We've all been affected by that. And as we said at the end last week, there's nothing we could do to actually fix what we as human beings have broken. Only Jesus could do that. And so he came to rescue us from that sin and the death that sin always leads us into. And this is why it was so important for him to be both fully God and fully human. This isn't in your notes, but one of the things I wanted to point out for you is that Jesus had to be fully God and fully man to do this for us, because for someone to rescue us, it had to be someone outside of us that wasn't affected by all of this, that hadn't been stained and marred and distorted by sin the way that all of us have, that it had to be outside of us, but he also had to be one of us. And this is why Jesus became man as well. As God, he could come to save. As man, he could stand in our place. And he could die the death that our sin actually deserved. Ryan mentioned that at the very beginning when we got started today. He died the death that our sin deserved. He paid the ransom to set us free from the bondage and the power and the control, the chains of sin and death and darkness that consume us and hold us back. Jesus came to rescue. He was outside of us, but he became one of us so he could redeem us and set us free from that. A couple passages, one in particular that I love with this is found in the book of Colossians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. Colossians was written by this same guy, Paul, who wrote the verses in 1 Corinthians 16 that we've been talking about together. And in this letter to some churches in the area of Colossae 2,000 years ago, he opens his letter to them in chapter 1, and he's describing the supremacy of Jesus, how big and amazing and unfathomable Jesus is, uncomparable. And one of the things that he says about Jesus, actually talking about God's saving work through Jesus, he says this: for he, God, has rescued us from the dominion the power, the control, the bondage, the chains of darkness, and has brought us into the kingdom of the Son, Jesus, he loves, in Jesus, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of our sins. He came to save, and one of the things that he came to do as part of that was to rescue us from sin and death. Not only that, though, he came to reveal a better way for us, a better way to live. I think this is important for us to understand. I mean, why did Jesus, if he only had to come, die on a cross, rise again, and go back to heaven, why spend 30-some years here? Why do all the things that he did as a human being? Why live the life that he lived here? Why spend all of that time if he could have come, kind of completed the transaction, moved on back out of here, and called it a day, called it mission accomplished? Why didn't he do that? I think one of the reasons he didn't is that Jesus was never just interested in taking us to heaven when we die, but he actually came to begin putting the pieces back together again here, right where we find ourselves, right where we live. And he came to show us, he came to reveal through his life what it looks like to live the way that we were always made and meant to live. It was part of the way that he saves us, not only by rescuing us from sin and death, but revealing to us a better way to live. The world will suck us into a black hole of telling us this is how you live, this is what life's all about, do these things, keep up with the culture around you, just follow the recent fads and the things that are popular, and whatever the world around you does, that's how you're supposed to do it. And Jesus came to show us, no, wait a minute, I want to save you from that by revealing through my life and my example a better way to live. And so this is one of the things that Jesus did. He did that in his life, through his teachings, through his miracles. He even did that in his death. And I think part of what happened when Jesus died on the cross wasn't just paying the price for our sins, although I think that was part of it. He died the death that our sin actually created and deserved. Not only did he do that, though, I think even in the example of the cross, Jesus was showing us a better way to live, a way of sacrificial, unconditional love, a way of forgiveness, a way of choosing and preferring to actually die for our enemies as opposed to just destroy them. He came and showed us what we were actually made to be from the beginning. And revealing that to us, it's one of the ways that he came to save us. And then lastly, he not only came to rescue us from sin and death and reveal to us a better way to live, but also to reign as king over all creation, over everything that he had made. If you remember last week, and in fact, I have up here on the screen again my incredibly artistic drawing that I shared with you last week, right? And I won't get into all the details of that, but last week I shared with you that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and the plants and the animals, and then as kind of the pinnacle of his creation, he made us in his image, right? We talked about that last week. It's one of the reasons we have dignity and value and worth, and so that's why we're floating high in the sky there, because unlike anything else in all of creation, we were made in his image, made to reflect him to each other, to the creation around us, and made to reflect the worship of creation back to our God as our creator. And in the beginning, when everything was kind of in its place and fulfilling its purpose, we said that there was this thing called shalom. There was this peace, this wholeness, their completeness when everything was in its place and fulfilling its purpose. We said last week that things didn't stay that way forever, though. The very first human being, Adam and Eve, rejected all of this. They rebelled against this, and they said, we don't want to live under your kind of rules, God. In fact, we're not sure we should trust you with that. We're not sure you want what's best or know what's best for us. Maybe we should call our own shots. And when they ate this fruit from the tree that God told them not to eat from, essentially they scrapped this that we put up there on the screen, and we reintroduced kind of our own way of things. We removed God from his rightful place in our lives, and we started replacing him with all sorts of other people and things, and rearranging the parts, sometimes putting ourselves in his place, sometimes putting other people, sometimes putting things from the creation itself, addictions, lust, idolatry, all kinds of things where we let other things take God's place. We put ourselves above other people, we put ourselves below other people, and all of a sudden we make a terrible mess of this good order that God created in the beginning, and we lose this peace or shalom or wholeness that he had for us. Part of Jesus' saving work in your life and my life and in our world is that he didn't come just to give you a ticket to heaven when you die, but to put the pieces back together again, to rearrange things the way that they were always supposed to be. And that won't happen until Jesus is king on the throne of your heart and your life and my heart and my life, and in fact, our whole world again. One of my favorite verses in all the Bible that talks about this is found in Colossians chapter 1, verses 19 to 20. You see it up here on the screen again, just several verses later in this opening chapter where Paul's writing to the churches in Colossae there. And he gives this description of Jesus. I read a few verses earlier in verses 13 and 14, but here he says, "For God was pleased to have all of his fullness, all of his divine kind of godness to dwell in this man, Jesus, fully God, fully man." God was pleased to have all of his fullness to dwell in him, in Jesus, and through him, through Jesus, to reconcile, to bring back together to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making what? By making peace through his blood shed on the cross, by making shalom, by putting the pieces back together again through what Jesus came to do for us. Part of his saving work is Jesus becoming king again in this world, starting with you, starting with me, starting with those who will bend their knee to him, but eventually for the whole world. So that one of the things that we actually read in another letter written by this same guy named Paul to a church in the town of Philippi that he helped start. I don't have this up on the screen there for you. But he writes them and he says, because of what God the Father was able to do for the world through Jesus, he says this, "Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him," Jesus, "the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." Part of his saving work is not just giving you a happy eternity when you die. It's part of that, rescuing us from sin and death, but also revealing to us a better way to live and reestablishing his reign here on earth, as the Lord's Prayer suggests, as it is in where? Heaven. We're going to talk more about that next week with kingdomology and what that means for us. But make no mistake, one of the things that we'll talk about with that is Jesus didn't come to take sides. He came to take over you and me and this whole creation that we've made a mess of, but that he never gave up on. And he came to rescue it and to reveal a better way and to reign again as king over it all. So what does all of this mean for us? A few things that you see there on the screen. We believe Jesus is fully God, fully man, and he came to save. What does it mean for us? A couple quick applications that I want to challenge you with. The first one is this. You see there on your sheet up on the screen as well. I think we need to learn from Jesus about who God is and about who we were made to be. Again, there are a couple great verses I want to read for you with this. One is found in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. Again, the author to the Hebrew audience there, he says this, in describing Jesus, he says, Jesus, the Son of God, is the radiance of God's glory. And he is the exact representation. Can you say that? Turn to someone next to you and just say, exact representation. The exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. One of the other passages I'll read for you with this in Colossians 1, chapter 1, verse 15. A lot of stuff out of Colossians 1 that's so good for us. But in describing Jesus, not only did he rescue us from the dominion of darkness, not only did God reconcile all things to him through Jesus and make peace through his blood shed on the cross, but one of the descriptions Paul gives us there of Jesus is this, that Jesus, the Son, is the image of the invisible God. We read in Hebrews, the exact representation of his being, but he's the image of the invisible God. In light of what we talked about together last week, I think that what that means for us is that Jesus is the best picture for us of who God is and how God is. He's the image of the invisible God, the God that we can't see, we can see in who? Anybody? In Jesus. You see, I believe that God has always been like Jesus, and always will be like Jesus. And if we have questions of what God is like and who he is and how does he work and how does he operate, we don't need to look any farther than who? Jesus, the image of the invisible God, the exact representation of his being. There are a lot of people that walk away from God, that lose their faith in God, that can't get their arms around God because they have all sorts of stereotypes and misrepresentations and misunderstandings. They picture God in all sorts of unhealthy, dysfunctional ways. And my hope and prayer for them, and if that's you in the room tonight, my hope and prayer for you is that you would give yourself another shot to get to know God as he truly is, as revealed in Jesus. In the very beginning with Adam and Eve, what was their temptation? To doubt that God wanted what was best and knew what was best for them. They misunderstood who God was. They weren't sure that he could be trusted. And since the very beginning, God has been trying to reintroduce himself to the world as he truly is. And for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, human beings have been getting it wrong and misunderstanding and assuming wrong things about who God is. And God, throughout history that we read in the Old Testament, all the way leading up to his son, Jesus was trying to reintroduce himself. And it peaked. It reached its kind of culmination in Jesus. He's the image of the invisible God, the exact representation of his being. And I think we should learn from Jesus about who God is, but also who we were made to be. Again, we're made in God's image. If he's the image of the invisible God, he is the example for what it looks like for us to live in the image of God as well. Again, it's one of the reasons why Jesus lived here for so many years and did what he did. It's why we talk about our faith in terms of being a follower of Jesus. We're trying to become like Jesus and do what Jesus did, because not only is he the greatest picture, the most perfect picture of who God is, he's also, as a man, he's the best and fullest and most accurate picture of who you were made to be and who I was made to be and who each and every person that we encounter in this world have been made to be. We ought to learn from Jesus who God is and who we were made to be. The second thing is that we need to lean on Jesus as the only one who could and the only one who came to save. Again, when it comes to that idea of being the only one who could, I told you earlier, he had to be fully God and fully man. He had to be someone outside of us, but also one of us, right? And Jesus was, and as that, he was the only one that could save. We couldn't do it ourselves. I mentioned last week the story of Noah. God tried to reset with Noah thousands and thousands of years ago, and even Noah, the most righteous person in all of humanity in his day, that God said, maybe I could start over with him. Even with the best of us, there was still some worst of us. And with Noah, even Noah, someone as good as Noah, couldn't fix it. It couldn't be part of our, it had to be outside of us, but also someone who was one of us. And only Jesus could do that. And not only that, only Jesus came to do that. I don't know how much you know about other religions, but I'm telling you, there is no other faith or religion like this. Every other religion, every other faith, it's a game of trying to figure out who God is or who the gods are and what he's like or she's like or it's like or they're like, if they exist at all, and it's a guessing game, trying to figure that out and trying to figure out our way to make our way back to them if we ever were with them to start. Only in our faith, only in what God has revealed to us through Jesus, do we find a God, the one true God, who actually, instead of making us guess and work to try to make our way back to him, he actually came to us in Jesus. He was the only one who could. And I'm telling you, you can deny this and ignore this, but he's the only one that came for you and for me. And I think part of one of the questions, if you don't wrestle with anything else throughout this series, my prayer for every one of us is that we would wrestle till we have a good answer to the question, what are we going to do with Jesus? What are we going to do with him? Nobody denies that he lived and walked on earth. I mean, that even people that have no faith at all believe that. And there's great history, not just biblical history, but extra biblical history that talks about how this character named Jesus was crucified on a cross. And there's great evidence, not just faith, but great evidence to suggest that not only did he die, but he rose again. He's the only one who could, and the only one that came to save. And The most fundamental question and foundational question for each of us is, so what are we going to do with him? I think his desire for each one of us is that we would see the love that he's demonstrated in coming for us, and we'd humbly put all of our trust in him. It's one of the things I challenge you with. And the last thing is this, that not only do we need to learn from Jesus about who God is and who we were made to be and lean on Jesus as the only one who could and the only one who came to save, but then lastly, I think we need to commit to live for Jesus as King over all. Again, we're going to talk more about this next week with kingdomology and what does that mean to be a part of the kingdom of Jesus, to live for King Jesus. And yet I want to remind you again, I think this is what this is all about. I said to you earlier, Jesus didn't come to take sides, but to take over. He didn't come to be just a footnote in your life story. He didn't come to be just kind of one little puzzle piece in the overarching puzzle of your life and how all that comes together. He didn't come to be your religion box that you check as compared to every other religion, just a part of your life. He came to be king of you, of me, and of this whole thing. And he revealed himself that way. It's one of the ways that he came to save. And I think one of the challenges, again, I hope you wrestle with, is not only learning from Jesus about who God is and who we are made to be and leaning on Jesus as the only one who could and the only one who came to save, but then also living for Jesus as your king.